Welcome, she-devils and bikini blenders, to the blood-soaked fields of the Mortal Realms, because today we are talking about the Daughters of Cain, specifically the consequences of their actions in Broken Realms. Now, I am going to be doing a full deep dive into the new Daughters of Cain lore and stuff like that, but there was one or two topics that I think really needed addressed before I took the time to do the full lore series. And they all have to do with the actions that were taken in the Broken Realms. Now, I do have an entire video series about the Broken Realms campaign books that we're looking at, specifically Broken Realms Morathi. If you wanted to follow along with those videos, I'll have a link down below. But the two questions that really stood out to people as this book was coming out was, one, how can they still be allies with all of these Order factions after they kind of royally hosed over all of their friends? And I answered that in its own dedicated video. And today's is going to be, what are the consequences? Like, even if we can still work together, are there any lasting ramifications for their actions in Broken Realms? And there's actually a story in the Daughters of Cain battle tome that I think is a fascinating insight into the long-lasting consequences here. Now let's talk about this story. It is on page 23 of the Daughters of Cain battle tome, the newest one that's just come out. And the story is Anvil's Unbroken. As an act of good faith, Morathi releases those Anvils of the Heldenhammer captured during the annexation of Anvilgard, many of whom had been kept locked in shadow magic trances ever since that dark day. Returning in shame to their comrades, a warrior cult forms amongst themselves called the Solemn Knights, and they wear the white kraken of Anvilgard that was emblazoned upon their jet black armor. All of them swear a vow that they will accept no honors or accolades until Har Kieran is retaken and their mark of dishonor erased. For her part, Morathi Cain has learned much from her prisoners. Though none were harmed during their incarceration, the goddess peered keenly into their lightning souls, studying the God King's work and searching for secrets that might prove vital in the wars to come. Now, usually when I do these kinds of lore tidbits from, the stories, this is actually in their kind of timeline that they have. Normally there's like a battle or something like that. I could talk about the two forces, but this one, of course, is a little bit different. For those of you who want the super brief blow-by-blow, like the bullet points, Morathi attained godhood in that first book, and she took over in this book. They used the term annexation, which is, I'm going to say graceful, of Anvilgard. It's one of the major cities, one of the first bastions of order within the realms. It's located in the realm of fire, if anyone's curious. Sort of a coastal hub of trade and supply, and they took it and they renamed it Har Kieran, now that it belongs to the Daughters of Cain. Now, the way they were able to do this was quite ingenious. You have to remember, these cities are colossal, so how did she do it without reinforcements coming? Well, there's two arms to this strategy. The first one is that she had already sowed the seeds of revolution in the city, which we'll talk about here in a second. But the more important one, the more relevant to this story, is that the Anvils of the Heldenhammer, who were there, they had a storm keep station thing. I'm not sure if it was a full storm keep, I can't recall, but it was a large base. Well, when they did the usurping, I guess you could say, or the annexation, they managed to subdue all of the Stormcast, but did not kill them, specifically so that their souls could not go back to Azir and warn somebody. This is a trick that was done in other parts of the Broken Realms series, specifically Broken Realms Morathi. It happens at the same time. And as I was reading that, I was like, well, how come none of these soldiers are going back and warning anybody? They're not dying. So even though I'm sure the forces of what is now Har Kieran died in droves trying to subdue Stormcast, because remember, they're all like, one Stormcast is worth like 5 guys, like in terms of just raw physical strength. I'm sure they lost a lot in trying to capture them, but by doing so, they denied Sigmar the chance to react. So no warnings went to Azir when she did this, and that's kind of where the story ended for Har Kieran in the Broken Realm series. All we know is that there were these huge stockades and like prisons where Stormcasts were being held, and we're kind of informed now that they're held in sort of a stasis with dark magic, or shadow magic, I should clarify. And I was so keenly interested in this because it was, bar none, my favorite of the Broken Realms books. Anytime there's like a play-by-play or a beat-by-beat, I guess probably how to say it, when it comes to a city under siege, I love that stuff because it's like just small enough for me to like understand the scope and scale of everything happening, and I understand how a city works. I'm a city boy, I've been in one my whole life, So the idea of like things just rushing down the streets and tearing up buildings, it's absolutely something that I can conceive of. And to kind of set up, I know I'm talking a lot about that when it seems like I should just be pointing you to the Broken Realm story, but there are a few plot threads within that are very important to this story of Anvil's Unbroken. First off, the actions of the Stormcast Eternals in that city, what was Anvilgard, actually began as sort of a witch hunt. Morathi had seeded her revolution by funding criminal organizations that Anvilgard was rife with. Okay, and this is, if I'm not mistaken, the Black Scale Coil. Someone please correct me in the comments if I said that wrong. And so there was this vague idea of like, something not good is happening here, but they were completely blindsided by the sheer scale of this revolution. And on the day when everything went down, all hell breaks loose, right? Garrisons are raided, the streets are running with blood, they've got witch elves going around slicing people. You have normal citizens just revolting against anyone near them. The Stormcast are trying to help. They do have better weapons. They, obviously can take on a whole lot more combat than your average human can, meaning like your free guild soldier. But the Stormcast resistance is stamped out pretty brutally. Because not only did they use a lack of information to beat their foes, meaning no Stormcast went back to warn anybody, but also, remember, this is essentially a civil war within the city. We know, as readers outside of the context, that it's Morathi annexing a city, but internally to the characters, it's like a civil war. Because all of these folks lived here before, in addition to an invading force that's coming in. Meaning, and my point for all this, is simply to say that how do you know who is friend and who is foe? Because they look identical. Certain aspects of the local Free Guild Guard had been bought and sold by the criminal syndicate that runs the city, meaning now Morathi if you go all the way up the food chain. Others are just random people who were like, their ships were docking for resupply and they have no business being here, but they've gotten caught up in all of the mess. So there's a whole spectrum of people, and so it's like, it's not even like you can just blindly fire. You'd be destroying the very people you're trying to protect just as much as you're killing any kind of attacker. And while the events of that actual fight I covered very well in Broken Realms Morathi, what I really like here is that we got to see the evolution of this city. We saw it from its birth, meaning when Age of Sigmar started, Anvilgard did not exist. We saw it founded, and then we saw the tides turn. We get a lot of hints that Sigmar is just absolutely livid. I kind of touched on this in the how is she still working or allies with other factions. It's not because they like her at all. But this story presents to us an answer to a question that was long unanswered, is what happened to those Stormcasts that were captured? They aren't dead, they aren't reforged, so what happened to them? While being released back to, your forces, meaning back to Sigmar or, their main chamber, it sounds like they're getting off easy. Like, no, there were no technical casualties taken. Well, casualties don't matter to the Stormcast, they keep coming back. What does matter is their pride and honor. Because as their humanity is stripped away, they see the world as more black and white, and so all of a sudden those things become life and death as opposed to insult or injury. These Anvils of the Heldenhammer failed on a lot of levels. Like, this is a truly martial culture marked by a extremely embarrassing failure. Not only did they fail to detect any treachery that's happening there were entire garrisons of Anvils of Heldenhammer there. None of them had a definitive lead on the Black Scale Coil. So all of that was happening. The machinations of an entire civil war were happening under their noses and they didn't see it. Secondly, they failed to stop the actual uprising. When the day came, they didn't stop it. They are supposed to be the bulwark that defends them from any internal or external strife. They failed that, and to add the last little bit of insult there, they did not even get to die to the last man doing it. There would be a lot of honor in saying, I'm going to be a one-man wrecking crew and go take out this whole thing of witch elves that are trying to take over the town center. I'm just making this up. But you know what I mean? You get the sense of they're willing to die and fight as hard as they can for these things, but they weren't even allowed to do that. This must be the most supremely embarrassing thing possible. Because at least, we read other stories where Stormcast die without making much of an impact, and at least they're revered as they were there, ready to battle, they were, on their toes, making sacrifices, all those kinds of things, even if the Stormcast just got iced in 2 seconds by Dorgar. But this is one where it's you didn't even get to die honorably. You got rugby tackled by a bunch of nobodies and threw into a chamber. And like Morathi made you go into a hard nap for a couple weeks. Not good, bro. Not going to look good when you're trying to get a promotion. My point is, though, this was a failure on a lot of different levels. So having this story, I think, was important because citing the fact that they bear such an immense amount of shame is good, because it means you and I can obviously make our own minor chambers. They call them a warrior cult, right? Yes, the Solemn Knights. And that's a really cool idea. And if you have those old Anvilgard like shoulder pad bits that they used to make, what an awesome way to use those, to paint them white in honor of Anvilgard. And you know what? They should bear the shame. It was a shameful thing by their own standards and reckoning. Now, the other part of this story that I find very fascinating is they really do specify that Morathi was studying them. She didn't hurt them. She didn't kill anybody. It was not a bloodless battle, but specifically for the Stormcast, she didn't kill any of them. But instead, she was studying them. And that's not good. Let's just say that. It's not good because Morathi happens to be quite wise. She has a very tight grasp on magic and how it works. And remember, at the time of this writing, all we know is that the Stormcasts are formed from a secret between Sigmar and Grugni. They know how Stormcasts are made. Everybody else is a little bit oblivious. We even saw this in the book Soul Wars by Josh Reynolds. Stormcast is caught and goes down to Shyish, and he's basically taking him apart and studying his soul. And we, as readers, can tell that this is important because not one, but two deities now have stopped everything that they're doing and put a magnifying glass under a Stormcast. Somehow, Grugni was able to devise a way to graft the lightning of Azir onto a soul of a warrior. But we don't have a whole lot of idea of how this can be twisted or used for more nefarious purposes. Because, like, what if Morathi found a way to do the exact same thing with, like, Cainite blood or something like that? You know, I'll just make up something. We'll call them the Blood Forged Cast, whatever you want to call them. It would unlock an entirely new power for her. Imagine if you struck down a snake lady, and instead of being reforged like Stormcasts are, she comes up from a cauldron of blood because there's all these priestesses trying to bring her soul back, just as there are Stormcasts in Azir reforging Stormcast. My point is, the more people, or deities rather, that have a chance to study how Stormcasts work opens the door for their own variants. Because in this setting, magic is a scientific discipline to an extent. So it seems like a process that could be learned, right? If you can reverse engineer it, you can learn it. And if you can learn it, you can innovate upon it. And so I want to end this story. I know it's very short with why is this cool. Like, usually these have a lot of different factions and stuff that I can chat about. This one's a little bit more straightforward, but I like it. The events of Broken Realms, Morathi specifically, raised a lot of questions and did not deliver a whole lot of answers because she just kind of kept the pain train moving to the next location. But this little passage is a great reminder of the warrior pride that Stormcast have, but also their limits. They are far from all-knowing or all-powerful. You can deceive them, you can hide things from them, you can overpower them in a non-lethal way if you need to. And when machinations far outside their scope come to fruition, they were found wanting. And this also raises a lot of interesting questions about other cities. Like, do they have crime syndicates that we don't yet know about? Are they funded by Morathi? Are they funded by a chaos god? Meaning, like, I say funded in quotes there, but like, it's their patron. Because we saw in the book Excelsis, Tzeentch did the exact same thing in City of Secrets. He built an entire enterprise in the city. In his case, instead of being necessarily like a crime syndicate, it was more about funneling the seer stones that come out of the slice of the world that was over in Excelsis. But same concept. There's this whole criminal network underneath their noses and nobody saw it. And one of the themes and notes that we hit in Soul Wars was the cost of control. And by that I mean the Stormcasts are so diligently fighting chaos, if they see any ounce of it within their cities, they would just rather destroy them. There's a whole story about Nurgle. Some folks were sick with a cold and Stormcast just wiped them out because Nurgle's here. We need to contain this. And you can justify a lot of atrocities in the name of keeping everybody safe. But what if we're not safe? What are we paying this cost for? Why would we live under a totalitarian, however altruistic Sigmar is? I personally think he's a good guy who's just mistaken a lot. But the cost of living under his rule it doesn't guarantee the safety that he claims it does. And that gets real messed up. And there's no easy answers. So for one, I like this story. I'm glad they ended it there. I want to read more about the Solemn Knights and kind of have some stories or short stories regarding them, what they're doing. And because you got to remember, they're still Stormcast. They are probably redeployed somewhere else. All they want to do is retake Anvilgard. But right now, that is not high on Sigmar's docket. Everything going on in Gur is. So these guys absolutely have a reason to be fighting anywhere, but I'm excited to see their story come to fruition one day when it comes back to Har-Kuron becoming Anvilgard. Anyway, friends, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I'd love to read them. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming.